Welcome to Rune Soup, a podcast about magic, culture and the paranormal, coming to you from Zealand down under. My name is Gordon and I shall be your host. Enjoy. Today on Rune Soup, we are speaking with Senior Research Fellow of the Ngai Tahu Research Centre at Canterbury University, Dr. John Reid. Dr. Reid is a specialist in economic and social development within an indigenous context, with a particular emphasis on New Zealand and Polynesian experiences. Dr. Reid, thank you very much for your time.
No problem.
Lovely. All right, so we have a traditional first question. So, John, were you a weird kid?
I suppose in a way I was. I was I wouldn't say so much a loner, but I certainly had spent a bit of time to myself and certainly enjoyed my own company. Maybe that counts as being slightly weird.
Enjoyed your own company wandering the countryside? Enjoyed your own company in a library? I mean, were you like a proto-academic as a kid?
No, not really. I was pretty much. I actually came into academia quite late. I was never that good at school and so on. But when I was a child, I did. I spent a lot of time. Had a childhood where I could roam, and a mother that let me do so. So I didn't really have too much in the way of boundaries, and so yeah, I got to. I suppose, relate to the world in a way that was less restrictive.
And this roaming childhood, was that in the Canterbury area?
No, I grew up in Auckland, actually, on the outskirts of Auckland and in the North Island. But I also had my grandfather, who I spent a lot of time with in the far north of New Zealand, had a 50-acre forest area where he lived, and they lived where they hunted and fished and so on, and pretty much lived a subsistence lifestyle. So I used to spend a lot of time there as well, and able to spend a lot of time exploring and roaming.
Well, yeah, that's good roaming territory. 50 acres of far north New Zealand forest.
Yes, that's right. Yeah.
Nice one. So when you say you came to academia later than usual, I mean, let's go through that story.
Yeah, sure. So, well, I never quite fit in at school particularly well. I never liked structures. Structures were always things that always made me feel restricted. And so I was always kind of more of a rebellious type kid. I also didn't quite fit into. I didn't enjoy there was no outlet for kind of what I thought was more of a free way of thinking. And so I didn't do particularly well, and I was advised not to actually to go to university by my school. But what I used to do would be just I was quite cynical. I'd sort of study just at the ends of the year and just do enough to scrape by, which enabled me to go to university a bit later. So that's really the background behind that. And but then once I got to university, and I found there was a lot more choice, and you were left to your own devices, and to particularly if you chose the right subjects, you had the ability to explore. And I suppose once I realised that, you had the ability to explore, and if you got the right lecturers and the right sort of environment, you could be innovative as well.
So was there a particular text or theorist or subject that made you kind of think, oh, wow?
Yeah, I went and did human ecology at Lincoln University, and this was a really different course. And what it did was it broke down, it systematically kind of broke down Western ontology or Western worldview, and then enabled you to kind of see it from the outside in. And then at the same time, it simultaneously explored multiple worldviews around the world. And it was accompanied with a lot of environmental field trips and so on. the idea behind it was to kind of really question the cultural frame or the dominant cultural frame, and to come in from different cultural perspectives. And so that was really the kind of something that sort of turned a light on for me, because of my own questioning around the kind of sort of the explanations you're given by the dominant culture, and of why the world is the way it is. And it opened me up to see, wow, there's just so many ways that you can look at something, and you don't want to be kind of myopically redirected by your the dominant cultural frame. So I think that was the significant influence.
And there's presumably, I mean, this is quite common, there's a sort of retroactive validation to how you've sort of experienced the world your whole life, when you kind of encounter that breaking down of the kind of unconsidered assumptions of materialism and modernity, and you look at it and go, wow, I'm not only, it feels so good to be amongst people or ideas that resonate with how I've actually experienced my life.
Yes, exactly. And I think it's also quite terrifying too, because there's a certain security there's security in holding on to a particular paradigm, that kind of that gives you some certainty in a world that's pretty uncertain. As soon as you step out and start to think, wow, actually, things could be, I might not have it all together here. I may not understand it all. That can also be a quite a intimidating experience as well, until you become, more comfortable that there's other ways of reframing things, and actually that you have the ability to reframe things yourself.
And so after that encounter with human ecology, was it sort of off to the races? Did you think, actually, this is what I can see myself getting involved in these sort of wider fields of research and exploration?
Yeah, well, what I did then was I went to, Māori culture has always fascinated me, and I do have Māori cultural heritage. And so I wanted to explore the world from that frame. And so I then started my PhD, which was a very long project, working with Māori landowners, communal tenure owners around the country in different locations, looking at how they saw and viewed their relationships to land, but also how they wanted to perhaps develop their land or develop their communities with their land. And that's where that sort of next step into opening up an entirely new way of thinking and seeing and doing things. And that went on for quite some time. And while I was doing that, I also became employed by Ngai Tahu, which is the largest tribe by territory in New Zealand. So it's most of the South Island of New Zealand. And then I started working there at the same time with landowners, and then later became the development manager there, where I was responsible for delivering on their economic and social development programs.
See, that sounds fascinating to me for a couple of reasons. As we sort of mentioned in the emails beforehand, if my partner's Kiwi, I'd lived there for 6 years and so on. And actually, I briefly tried to get funding for a documentary called The Billionaire Tribe about Ngai Tahu, because we're kind of getting to the questions in and out of order. I have a few of them here, but I want to jump in on this now because that fascinates me. But I think a lot of people mistake with the topic of our conversation is sort of bringing animist worldviews to the table, so to speak.
Yes.
People mistake that for some sort of Edwardian pastoralist fantasy about essentially just, looking after furry little animals. But animism is anti-modernity rather than anti-modern. And it's really interesting that your experience is with economic and social and cultural development within a worldview like this, because it was my experience in New Zealand that the country leads the Western world in having those perspectives at a modern table rather than a modernity table, and Ngai Tahu, I think, is the best example of that.
Yeah, I think you're right there. The I certainly experienced that with sort of colleagues from the States. They have to deal with a lot more internal issues around the legitimacy of their tribal cultures and identities. There's very still much a developmentalist mindset where they're still perhaps considered primitive or undeveloped or in needing of development. Whereas what it is here is, you still have that narrative running through the dominant culture, but there's still an acceptance of the uniqueness of Māori and the ability to be able to apply their frame within, our contemporary context. The thing is, though, that the term animism itself is kind of loaded.
Oh, yes.
And so often using that term among Māori is often, like they sort of kind of might raise their eyebrows and say, why are you using that term? But I think it's important to kind of re-own the term and to redefine it from a Māori perspective. So that's kind of like where a lot of my work has been coming in, starting to rewrite and work in the certainly at the academic edge of thinking in this area, to rewrite animism from an indigenous perspective so that it can be kind of re-owned in that sense, if that makes sense.
Well, it does, and that's the sort of the question of the hour right now. To give people who maybe don't have the same experience with New Zealand a context for what we were just talking about, that these ideas are at a closer to level playing field in dominant New Zealand culture versus, say, the Aboriginal Australian experience or American First Nations. It's a bit of a tired example, but it's one I go to fairly often, which is the sort of famous rerouting of State Highway 1 around like a Taniwha Lea coming out of Auckland. And so you have a sort of very expensive national project that did in fact take into account the traditional sort of spirit relationship with the land, and that is exceedingly rare in the West.
Well, and I think it even goes further than that. So there's places like when Ngai Tahu had their settlement, they had all their wahi tapu sacred sites sort of returned to their control and management as part of that. The settlement, which was compensation for past wrongs against them by the New Zealand government. But there's also a lot of co-governing relationships between the tribe and other governing bodies, whether they're councils and so on. But we're finding a lot of words like Mauri, which means life force, which we can probably talk about a bit later. But the term Mauri coming up in New Zealand government policy about protecting the Mauri of rivers, protecting the Mauri of land. Or also the term kaitiaki is appearing in New Zealand legislation and policy all the time now too, which is the traditional guardianship role of over Mauri or over the life force of different animals and plants. So you're seeing animism in that sense sort of stepping its way into New Zealand's policy and legislative framework today. So and it's to me it's quite an exciting sort of thing to happen, and to also have these terms starting to be used in day-to-day language amongst everyday New Zealanders was also an exciting thing.
Yeah, and both those terms are a very good example of kind of the, shall we say, the next level up. My initial experience, so my first afternoon in Auckland when I moved, I had a bunch of Kiwi friends and some Australians who were also living there, and we went out for drinks on Vulcan Lane, and we got to a point in the afternoon where I'm like, I have no idea what you idiots are talking about, because there were so many just te reo words that they were using normal, and only one of them was Maori. So, yes. But they were using these words in a dominant, within the dominant monoculture, which really impressed me. So when you're talking about the concept of, say, Maori is a more advanced and nuanced concept than the ones that I experienced when, the te reo became an official kind of government project, and words that were commonly used already at the time were like kia kaha and mana, and these are still animist concepts, but they are level 1 concepts, and now, as you just sort of expressed, we're experiencing that kind of level 2, and I do actually think that is it's really positive.
Yes, it is. Yeah.
All right, so we touched on this, and it's again the question of the hour or the topic of the hour. I agree 1,000,000% that animism as a term needs restoration because it has a sort of retroactive rewriting of where the actual concept actually came from, so that it can be elevated and used. I tend to be suspicious of putting the word new in front of something like new Coke.
Yes.
And I saw that with, new animism a while ago. But so let's talk about the history of the term. Like, where did the term animism come from in the first place?
So when we're starting to look at the history of it, I think it began with an academic or a researcher called Tyler. This is back in the 1870s or thereabouts, and it was sort of based on the idea that that indigenous people, well, that the pretty much imperialists were encountering as they travelled the world. They saw them as being kind of confused, and that they were projecting themselves onto nature. So what they were thinking was that these primitive people thought that the things around them had souls. So that was kind of the original kind of thinking of the term animism, was that these plants and animals were animated with souls like humans, and they thought that that was kind of a primitive way to think about things. And then it kind of evolved from there, and we had where there was a kind of view put upon indigenous people, where we had academics like Durkheim and Levi Strauss were portraying animism as a kind of more of a symbolic representation. So it's almost like poetry, like thinking that it's that indigenous people would be thinking of when they were referring to a plant or an animal as perhaps a relative, they would be thinking of that as being more of a poetical way of thinking rather than as a actual literal way of speaking. And so it was this idea that once again with this idea though that it was still kind of a people living in a almost like a poetical, fanciful world, and then but with both of those, with certainly that second perspective, the trouble with it is that, well, let's say that that they are being literal and they aren't being metaphorical when referring to a plant or an animal or a river as a relative.
And to interject there,
yes.
The indigenous cultures always said that. I mean, Levi Strauss never had an original experience in his life. Everything yes. was some kind of symbolic. It's just essentially very French. But the yes. actual traditional cultures that were encountered by these imperialists never once said it was a symbolic representation. They were up and down. No, I mean it how I said it.
Yes, yeah, exactly. And I think this is the thing, is that and this is from their perspective because they're coming out from a dualistic kind of worldview, is that if you accept that they're saying, no, we're not being symbolic, like if you were to ask, because most indigenous cultures have their own poetry, they have their own performing arts and traditions of poetry, so they know what poetry is, they know what metaphors and similes are. And so if you're asking an indigenous person are you being metaphorical, and they say no, then you'd have to assume they're mad or insane from a Western perspective, to be considering these kind of other entities as perhaps family or as something that is that they have a personal and conscious relationship with. And so I suppose that's and that was kind of the conundrum, and I think it's still the conundrum, because the idea that some of these ideas are quite literally meant is really problematic for certainly the scientific establishment as it currently stands, because it doesn't quite fit that sort of dualistic way of thinking about the world.
Well, that sort of Victorian premise of materialism sits in the middle of this like a magnet around iron filings.
Yes.
And you mentioned Edward Tyler. He was a Victorian materialist. So when he was writing about animism, it was within the context of this is a primitive, and he kind of used those 18th century ideas that these primitive people didn't understand how dreams worked, and that's where they get this idea of spirits from. And Tyler presented a model of the world that grew in like technological complexity towards the modernity that he experienced in London. And he was a materialist. He was a Darwinist. He didn't believe in a Christian God or anything either. He sort of was a card carrying adherent to this premise of materialism, and even though that idea has sort of fallen by the wayside in physics in the 30s and in philosophy in the 70s, it shapes how it presents challenges to how we elevate animism to a legitimate explanatory and experiential worldview, because we haven't actually looked at the sort of great big toad sitting in the middle of discourse, which is the sort of assumption that this one is correct and the other ones are ancillary or lesser. And that same thing happened with Levi Strauss. Like, he had to go with symbolism because it was a development in the sense that he at least credited these people with, with not being the same kind of savages that Tyler did, but it's still the presence of materialism warped how he analyzed it, because he didn't assert a external reality to that experience, to that, as you said, that sense of kinship with non-humans.
Yes, and I think it's nicely illustrated. I mean, to me, the key for illustrating the difference is to actually to look at the way, for example, Maori and will frame their world, and I don't think it's so much the world. It's not coming in from a worldview or a cognitive or a construct or a framework to frame the world with. It's about experiencing the world, and out from that experience, a worldview forms. And to explain that, I suppose a good starting point would be looking at the Māori word tipuna, which means the translation into English is really poor, and it's usually translated as ancestor. But from a Māori perspective, tipuna also mean that which basically means that which gives rise to you by way of a connected relationship. So and that can be a biological ancestor or a non-biological ancestor. So, for example, if a river has fed my family for generations, then it has been something that has given rise to me. Therefore, it is tipuna. And just as much tipuna as a direct biological ancestor, like my great-great-great-great-grandfather, gave rise to me as well. So, in that way, the language frames things very differently. And that framing means that you experience the world very differently as well. So, and I think that's that element. Once you have this direct experience of all the things that are giving rise to you in that sense, then and the interdependency and the symbiosis in your relationships between yourself and other entities, human and non-human, then you get it's a far more once you realize that's what's happening in terms of a direct experience, then you develop a language or a framework to explain that. And I think that's why for Māori, the whakapapa, or one's genealogy, isn't limited to humans, but includes non-humans as well. And it's that intricate network that gives rise to you that, that's the basis of Māori cosmology, is that one is a representation or a process that represents all those sort of interconnected and interwoven relationships. And it's all communicated in language of kinship and family, which kind of makes sense when you think of it, in that way. But if you look at it from a Western perspective and you said, the river is my ancestor, people would think, well, no, that's mad, because you're not it's not a biological, relation that didn't, you're not descended from it. But when you change it into Māori language, where there is no distinction between a biological and a material sort of entity giving rise to you, then it becomes quite a reasonable proposition.
And it absolutely, and interestingly enough, you can find these concepts expressed within a materialist monoculture. It's just that they don't assert the same level of value to that relationship. I mean, technically, if you live beside a river, given that the sort of molecular replacement of the human body is sort of all atoms replaced within 18 months, you are literally made up of the surroundings that you live in. So monoculture or materialism expresses this idea. And this is where I think we're going to get to the politics of not having animist perspectives within a almost like policy planning world means that we treat the river very differently. So we can both assert almost a 2.0 relationship, but in one of them, the river is devalued, and so we sort of fill it with farm runoff and so on. And in another one, its actual genuine value is asserted, and that changes not only how we experience it, but how we experience it moving forward, and what a custodianship relationship looks like.
Yes, and I think what happens is, in terms of the relationship to a river, so from, say a dominant cultural perspective in New Zealand, the river might be viewed primarily as a resource, and it's talked about that way, whether it's a resource for recreationalists or a resource for farmers for irrigation or whatever. It's thought of in that instrumental sense. And it's not that Māori wouldn't think of their river as a resource or something to use. It's just also that it, from that instrumentalist perspective, it's just simultaneously, it's also something that feeds you, that relates to you, that's also something that supports you. And it's that view of kinship and relationship that forms the underlying value set for the way you relate to it. But if you're only relating to it as something you use or something that's there for your use, rather than as something that you care for, so that it will support you in perpetuity, feed you clean drinking water, provide you with resources in that sense, and that sort of more symbiotic way of thinking about relationships. And, and to me, that's kind of key. But I think that comes back to that Western idea where it kind of splits things. So it will split things between instrumental and intrinsic. So something has some sort of intrinsic value, or it has an instrumental value. Whereas for Māori, those two ideas are not separated. They're both encompassed within sort of an idea like the idea of Māori.
Well, this is interesting. So, funny enough, when I was kind of making my notes and getting my thoughts in order for this discussion, I tried to think, well, what constitutes animism in a depolitical sense of the term, but also, as you mentioned, I think there's a very good case to be made for using that term and almost correctly politicizing it. And the characteristics of an animist worldview that I sort of jotted down were non-humans are humans too, which is essentially what we're talking about. And the other one, it's a bit dramatic, but it's an occultism podcast, so it works. But that sort of spirit-haunted world, and I'm just trying to work out. I mean, you sort of briefly mentioned, so we'll discuss it. What's the value of actually using that term animism in the discourse now, and however challenging it is, like what can we say about animism as a worldview?
Yeah, well, I think to me it's about challenging modernity, and the way the way I think is to step into understanding animism is to understand it first and foremost as an experience rather than as a form of logic. So that if you, and it's based on the development of a sense of the true experience of symbiosis. So if you, like we were just talking about before, if you were to, indigenous cultures are place-based cultures. So that if you do, over a long period of time, if you've developed, let's go back to the, analogy of a river. If you're on that river all the time and that river is feeding you and it's supported your family for generations, and you get that sense of being supported by it. I mean, and as well as being supported by it, a river may also be a threat. It can flood and so on. So it's a sense of both being supported and having some respect, because it's potentially it's bigger than you, it's stronger, and it's perhaps more dangerous. It can be dangerous as well, and that sense of symbiosis generates a sense of kinship and care and love and respect. And I think that is the key element to, and sort of in the most basic level, to that relationship. So I suppose I need some more prompting, really, to tease that out a bit more.
Well, that, I think, is, as you say, so we've got non-humans are humans too,
yes.
Which I think I might have stole from Graham Harvey or someone.
Yeah.
The fact, I mean, place is a good one. We should talk about that a bit more, because in an animist perspective, it is not just not simply an ecosystem. It has a personhood as well, in that kind of non-humans are humans too.
Yes.
And it's interesting, like, to go back to our metaphoric river.
Yes.
I think about one of the ways it can be, because it's so experiential, as you say, it's almost difficult to call it a worldview rather than an experience. There are ways that we can reposition it so it's sort of satisfying to the other voices at the table. And I think about, Husserl and that idea of consciousness kind of reaching out and to have that sort of external sense of meaning generated in place when you exist in it. And these are things that it strikes me that there is legitimacy and I would say even more legitimacy within this construction of a modern animist worldview, and it does have those policy implications for whether we view something as a resource or an and/or for the resource.
Sure, I think it comes back to so rather than seeing other things as humans, it's seeing them as persons.
Yeah.
So it would be, for example, we all have pets, so we might relate to our dog or a cat. We all know they're a member of the family, and then we know they have a personality, and we know they can relate to us, and they can settle into our family and so on. So we can develop and build a relationship with our family or pet, and we can also build and develop exactly the same types of relationships with the other, but we know with other animals and so on around us, or the land or other things, but we know that the dog is a dog, and it's a dog person, like we can relate to it but it's different from us as a human. So it has a different form of, it may have a similar consciousness, a similar type of conscious, that it is conscious like us, but that it has a different way in which that consciousness is expressed by its own behaviors and by its own inclinations as a dog or a cat or whatever animal we're relating to. And the same characteristics, a river has its own sort of persona and forms and characteristics. And it's those personas and characteristics that we need to come to understand and respect, in terms of, yes, they're different from us as people, as human persons, but they have personhood in of themselves in that sense. And I suppose the next step is sort of that kind of steps into the more shamanistic component of animism, which is where we relate to them, where they relate to us as persons. They reveal themselves to us as persons that we can consciously kind of connect and relate to. And that's kind of that, when you start stepping out of that sort of a materialist explanation and into more of a different worldview.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's important we shouldn't skip over the dog example, because
yes.
In going back to Edward Tyler, let's be clear that he thought that dogs were an inert accumulation of molecules and atoms. Like there was no personhood in it. And as making the notes for this discussion, funnily enough, I kind of thought you could make the case that animism is actually the most commonly experienced worldview on Earth, because if you if Edward Tyler came into your living room, for any pet owners out there, and just sort of pointed at your dog or cat and said, "There's nothing in that. that's literally just atoms," you'd look at him like he was a lunatic.
Exactly.
And it's interesting that you have for pet owners and the majority of people on Earth, the sort of natural human mode is animistic, and I think there are sort of wider. There's a wider upside from a kind of macro psychological health to making room for these modalities, because they're better for us and we're experiencing them anyway. So there's a legitimacy that comes with it. So you're not out of phase with the kind of Asperger lunatics like Richard Dawkins in the world.
Well, yeah, exactly. If you were to, I mean, you only have to look at our own genealogy, our own biological, genealogy, to know that we are, we're related to every single living thing on the planet genetically. I mean, we all have a common ancestor, every living thing. So we must all share a similar consciousness, right? We must all share the similar animation of life. But not only that, is that what parented that genetic sequence in the first place? Well, the environment did, right? It's the mountains, it's the oceans, it's the sky, it's the sun. All of those things gave rise to that life. So, obviously, at the end of the day, we're genetically related to every living thing, and we've been given rise to by, every other element all the elements that exist. Well, in Māori you'd call them atua. We are the product of them, and so we're related to them all. We can't, that's kind of an undeniable truth, and that is the kinship that we live within, and you can't step outside that.
No, this comes back to the river thing again. This idea is actually there in this sort of shaky premise of materialism. It's just that we don't credit it with the value that it probably needs. I mean, you can look through biology and find research into the last universal common ancestor. The actual emergence of life on this planet is, as you say at the beginning, there's no way outside the interconnected relationship through time and also like horizontally today. There's no way outside it, and even materialism will say this. It's just that it will say it whilst despoiling rivers and bombing people.
Yeah, exactly. And the thing is, humans are themselves biomes. I mean, we have gut flora and fauna within us and on our skin that we can't live without, that we're in a symbiotic relationship with. They give us minerals and nutrients and digest food for us, and we feed them. We have, our mitochondrial RNA is a virus. It was originally a virus, so it's a symbiotic relationship between our genetic makeup and its. And so we're not really any one thing composed of some sort of coherent, singular entity. We are ourselves little ecologies, conscious little ecologies, and nested within broader ecologies that get more and more, broad and interconnected. And those broader ecologies, I mean, whether it was a river ecosystem or whatever, there's no reason why it too, with its information flows, just like the information flows in our own body, can't be conscious or aware. And we can't relate to them in that sort of conscious related sense. And to me, that's kind of the home of shamanism, is that ability to transcend your own sort of conscious understanding of your own, being hemmed in by your own point of reference to your own biome, and they're able to interact more broadly with wider biomes and to understand those types of interactions. And I think, it's all pretty clear. The premise of it all is very strong. It can't really be questioned empirically. So from my perspective, there's no reason why, as a worldview, animism, to me, it stands on stronger ground.
Yeah, absolutely. That's the kind of what I find eternally frustrating, and it's been interesting you mentioned the microbiome. I'll come back to that in a sec. materialism has been falsified. Close to 100 years ago, it has been falsified. So it surprises me that, well, it frustrates me rather that we kind of have to softly around the kind of task of asserting this as a legitimate experience or worldview, because its competition is provably wrong. So you go, hang on, like, that kind of means we're ahead. Does that make sense?
Yeah, well, it does, and I think what it is that there's a fear of the change, of what it means and its implications, because at the moment, with a material worldview, humans are a form of consciousness that stands outside the material and can control the material, and that's why why our environment is viewed as a resource. We've even started calling humans resources now. So the kind of things that we control, resources are things you can control and extract energy from. Like you dam a river and you can extract its energy. It's a resource. You can extract food from it. That's a resource. It's a form of energy used by humans. The whole idea behind the whole premise behind the whole way of thinking is that you can, is the idea that things are manageable and in control. And it's very different from an indigenous worldview where you are relating to other things in a symbiotic and mutualistic way. So rather than being in management and control of things, you are actually in a form of negotiation and relationship. And it's about that sort of building that kind of sense of respect for things, and that sort of through that mutualism.
And interestingly, the asserting management or control never works, and this brings me back to the microbiome. So I've been kind of fascinated and sort of, I consider my microbiome a pet for the last couple of years. I've been kind of changing diet and doing things like fasting and adjusting and readjusting fermented foods and the kind of probiotic and prebiotic stuff, because again, it's the thing that appears, it does a lot more than we realize. I mean, it controls things like the immune system and metabolism and so on to a greater extent. And crucially, there are sort of, if not millions, hundreds of thousands of entirely different species in there, and we know 80 of them. And yes. Any time you try to manage for one of them, you collapse the entire system. That's the control and management bit failing. The only thing you actually can do is help it grow towards complexity or biodiversity, and that's by essentially getting out of its way. Like don't feed it corn chips, feed it alliums and high fiber and foods that we're quote unquote supposed to be eating, and the thing takes care of itself.
Well, it's kind of like it's what control gives rise to is monocultures.
Yes.
So because that makes things more controllable. So, when you're growing, whether it's a monoculture on a field or a monoculture in your stomach, our diet, a diet that's very restricted these days to a very small number of types of food and nutrients means that you create monocultures, a monocultural biome, and we lose all the diversity which was historically present, and gave rise to, better immunity and a whole range of other sort of beneficial factors.
And the monoculture, as you experience in wider ecosystems, is one of disaster. So anytime you have a monoculture, it's a blue-green algae bloom or something that indicates a lot of things are going wrong.
Yeah, exactly. And it's always self-limiting, because any bloom, any parasitic activity, which is monocultural, they go hand in hand. Parasites, they kill their host in the end. So you have to go back to symbiosis. You need to go back to mutualism, because that's the default setting for nature. It's what humbles us. I mean, it's exactly what you just knowing that you can't control things entirely. We have limited control, but the idea is that, isn't it much better that was always my interest in things like permaculture and so on, which have focused themselves on symbiosis and how you can build those strong, sort of relationships. If you build good soil quality, then you'll generate more food, and so on. So how you can create whole systems of diversity working in these synergistic kind of relationships, which is,
massive permaculture fan here myself. So,
yeah.
and it is essentially, I call it, it's applied animism or applied hermeticism, because you work with the natural pattern. So you move in the direction of biodiversity rather than opposite. Because if you go in the opposite, every civilization that has collapsed.
Yeah, well,
it seems fairly self-evident that more is better from a diversity perspective rather than less.
Yeah, exactly.
And the yields you get are 900% up, depending on like where you are in the world. But working with nature gives you orders of magnitude better yield than we get in our allegedly highly productive mono-agricultural systems that rely on, oil energy inputs and cause plagues and ruin the water table. They actually get orders of magnitude lower yield than moving with nature. Again, we're back to the sort of microbiome example.
Well, exactly, and what we have is wonderful science being generated in many areas around, ecological agriculture, and a lot of excellent work being done about how we can, work more in these, in ways that, for example, pest control using natural means, or planting, companion planting, all these sort of things that enable you to operate in far more sustainable ways. I mean, there's great stuff being that's out there that can be easily adopted. I think a lot of I suppose this is what frustrates me a little bit. I think a lot of the solutions are already present to many of our global issues, and the problem is being uptake. And I think that's more to do with the economic and political structures that make change of that sort very difficult.
Well, this is the worldview dysfunction. So I've been talking about this for a couple of years now, but why I want animism to have a seat at the big table is, if it gets a seat at the big table, as you say, there in pieces you have. I mean, I'm obsessed with Dr. Elaine Ingham's soil work and all those kind of other things in permaculture and in the sort of medium-term political changes that we need to make. There is a worldview available. We have one right here that coheres these sort of best practice ideas that we want to see deployed, and it's animism. And if you look at it strikes me as a worldview dysfunction. So I guess this is the sort of bit we were getting to before.
Yes.
Why do we use the term animism, and what are the sort of and if you were like a global animist dictator, Dr. Reid, what would like the next 10 years look like? What are the benefits of people bringing animism to the big table on kind of like a policy and so on perspective?
Yeah, I think the way the strategy is to use infiltration, and I think to use science to demonstrate the legitimacy of the worldview. I mean, it's sad to have to legitimize a worldview in this way, but I think everything points toward it being the correct worldview. And I think it is, to me, I'm not sure it can be done in that kind of in an authoritative kind of way in which, that is sort of an imposed way of thinking about the world.
Well, totalitarianism is monoculture.
Yeah, it'll be something that becomes self-evident and obvious to people, and I think it'll be something that that will transform. It'll take people on that journey, and I think to me, it's the key of where I would be focusing is in the arts and the mass media and the communication of how to express these ideas and it forms that kind of go past the human kind of filtering systems and go straight into the emotional areas, which we all know when we watch something that's a river being polluted or some terrible environmental sort of issue. It stirs us. It makes us sad. It's not something we want to see, and I think, but we also need to present these alternatives and ways of relating to places and to ecologies that work in the same symbiotic way, so that we also have the solutions. Because I think people are also very weary and worn out by all the negativity and that we're exposed to. But also, my God, there's so many. As I was saying, the solutions are there. There's so many excellent examples that can be taken in and adopted to bring about that change. And I think that change is happening anyway. I think it has to swing back. The world, it will do it, because animism's been the dominant worldview for human history. It's only been in the last short period that it's actually popped up, and I think it will, it's a monocultural
exactly,
and it'll be selected against eventually.
Yeah,
but it's
I think I agree. I think we're absolutely at that point, and I approve of the terrorist angle in my most recent book. That's because it's the decentralization rather than centralization is the same thing as saying monoculture versus biodiversity, and it does need to kind of pop up in that way. It doesn't. And I think people are not only just fatigued by the bad news. I think they're fatigued by the failure of solutions that are presented. It strikes me as, I'm extremely cynical about this, but how interesting that we've had several decades of probably over-exaggeration about anthropogenic global warming, as in, we're going to be 10 meters underwater by 1998 and all this stuff that didn't happen. But why I'm very cynical about that is how interesting that the solution appears to be a Goldman Sachs-funded carbon trading system rather than proper soil biome management that can carbon sink and improve yield in a local basis. It's again, they're going with, they're trying to trick us into thinking that more of the same will fix it, more of the same will make it worse. That's centralization rather than decentralization. And you look at it and go, hang on, it's that very Bill Mollison thing. He says, although the problems of the world appear insurmountable, the solutions are almost embarrassingly simple.
Yeah, and yes, it's true. And I think that there are some people who do very, very well, and for themselves through the way in which humans, society, and ecologies are managed at the moment through the technologies we've developed. So, become very wealthy, and in a lot of ways, humanity's benefited generally from technology, the technological changes that we've experienced. At the same time, though, there's been a deep alienation of people, and a loss of identity that's come from modernity, because we don't have those close connections back to our non-human kin, and then without those connections, we don't. There's a sense of loss, and because what we're doing isn't right. But I think there's the possibility to have your cake and eat it too. I think there's a possibility of having the solar powered home that's insulated, warm, and with sort of appropriate technologies that enable sort of these sustainable connections and symbiotic relationships with nature, and at the same time, not damage. I think that's possible, but through drawing upon our lessons and the technologies we've developed, and then using them more appropriately. But I think at the moment, the inappropriate use of them does work to the benefit of, certain powerful interests who,
And I mean, this comes back to what we sort of said at the beginning. Animism isn't primitivism, so it's anti-modernity rather than anti-modern. We should, and will hopefully, Kinshallah exist in a world of best use of technology and, not fucking the non-human persons that is the rest of the actual universe. What I find is interesting, you're talking about how it needs to emerge ecosystemically or organically. It's been interesting from a getting a seat at the big table perspective. In the last couple of books, my first book, I was, and I think rightly so, extremely cynical of how ancient history is constructed within the academy, because it's the discourse still has to pretend that materialism is correct. And so the first kind of third of the book is point by point laying out people that have committed fraud and just errors in thinking. And what happened once the book was that I got individual emails from anthropologists or whatever around the world, where they're like, we're actually all thinking this and discussing it in quiet little groups, that a kind of animist or spirit assertive model works better for history. It's just that when you go to the conferences, you have to pretend that you're not thinking like that, or otherwise your career's at risk. And it strikes me that one of the things we can do in the short term is to make a space so that people in the arts and in the academy and so on are aware that they're not the only ones thinking that actually this is a legitimate experience and worldview, and the time is right. The water's good. People should jump in.
Yeah, I think you're right. I sort of am lucky because I have the privilege of primarily working for a tribe that that does actually allow that academic kind of thinking and freedom, and being in the university here at University of Canterbury is my environment is generally supportive as well. And I suppose you couldn't really work in Indigenous contexts, and not really. And
no, you lose your job if you come in one day and go, guess what, I'm a materialist now. And say, well, how'd you go, John?
Yeah. So, and I think there are, and I think that's where perhaps there can be a counterculture forming, and is in that kind of area, and like you're saying in New Zealand with some of the what we'd call post-settlement, or tribes that have gone through compensation processes with the government, that they can be sort of power centres that push these types of approaches and ways of thinking to transform society in general. And like you say, I also think that idea of building networks between thinkers and creative people working on the edge of this is also a powerful way of creating solidarity, to provide a counterweight, so to speak.
All right. So for people, I mean, I know the audience reasonably well by now, and I know they're just hanging on every word, Dr. Reid, but now you have to give them some free teaching advice. For people who are like, I'm so into this, where are some good kind of either academic researches or books to kind of get people started on where animism is at, was at, should be at, that kind of thing?
So I would there's a couple of people, they're academic books, but Ingold is one, Ingold, and the other one is Willeslave. If you just Googled Ingold and animism, or Willeslave and animism, both of those two have stepped out of the old paradigm, have spent significant time actually living, experiencing Indigenous context, living and being in those Indigenous contexts to the point where they actually get it and can communicate it and treat it legitimately. I think those are a couple of really good people. But I think there needs to be actually a lot of work to pull, what we've just spoken about, to pull all that together in an academic sense and have it pass peer review. I mean, we're doing it. We've got some publications out there, but they're into into journals and so on, and they're written in ways that may not always be that accessible. But but to actually go through that process of transforming fields, transforming journals, transforming thinking around these things is a big task, and will take some time, because it's the thinking is really still forming, and it's often translating things out of from these existing Indigenous cultures and ways of thinking and language, and translating it into basically translating them into a Western worldview, and trying to communicate in a way that transforms that worldview is incredibly time-consuming and challenging. But we're certainly working on a book that's trying to pull all those sort of elements together. So, yeah, I suppose, from my perspective, I'd come back to those sort of Willis lives in Golds, and then, but watch this space with more things to happen, more things to come out.
Fantastic, and I'll do some hunting around and put that in the show notes for this episode. Well, Dr. Reid, this has been fantastic. Love the conversation. Love what you guys are doing. Again, thank you so much for your time.
Well, thank you.
So, hope you all liked that one. I know I did. Quite a number of you actually have really resonated with this topic area, and in fact, it's creeping up on the list of things that I get asked on an email basis in the video chats and so on. Actually, it probably sits somewhere near the top now that I think of it. As a result, I tried to maximize the time with Dr. Reid to give people, sort of a baseline in the animist discourse, as well as general pointers for further personal study. So let me know what you think at the RuneSoup Facebook page or at runesoup.com. Subscribe to the show in your favorite podcatcher or on YouTube, and find me on Twitter, where I am Gordon, Gordon_White, WHITE. Until next time.